Are you tired of winter like I am? After about Christmas and New Year's, I'm ready to get rid of the snow and move on to spring and summer for a new gardening season. But since we can't do that, we can console ourselves by growing our own transplants. And I'm starting a series today that talks about just that. First of all, you might ask the question, why should I grow my own when I can go down to the local garden center and buy them? Well, if you go down to the local garden center, you can buy them, but you can't buy just about anything that you want. For instance, I get this catalog, this is one among many that I get in the spring, it's called Totally Tomatoes. And as I look through this, there are so many tomato varieties that you just don't see in the local garden centers. So if you're interested in growing maybe some of the newest varieties or some of the really old heritage varieties, starting your own seed may be the only way to go. Unless you want to run around all over the state looking for those specific varieties. Also, in our area of Michigan, we have a fairly short growing season and many things can't be started from seed. Now, we all know we can put green beans in the ground and up they come and we'll get them during the season. But if I were to put tomato seeds in the ground, by the time they start to produce, we're going to have a frost here and I'm not going to get anything. And that's true with melons, for instance, like watermelon, especially some of the longer season watermelon and peppers. And there are a number of other things that they really need to be started early. Of course, you can start them early too to get an earlier harvest if you're able to get into your garden. But that's another reason that we like to grow them. Also, when you have these cloudy, cold days, by getting an early start on the gardening season by starting your own transplants, it's horticultural therapy. In other words, it makes you feel good. When I see my plants coming up, I start to think about all the wonderful tomatoes and melons and cucumbers and squash and all the different things that I'm going to get when my garden starts to produce for me. So it's not only good therapy, but you can get your kids involved and it can be a great family activity. And most kids love to play in the dirt anyway, so when they're potting plants and filling pots and things, they really enjoy doing that. And another added benefit of the family activity of getting kids involved in gardening is many times people used to tell me when I worked for Extension, my kids don't eat vegetables. And the first question I would ask them, what do you eat? Because kids eat what their parents eat, usually because that's what the parents give them. But I also told people that if your children are involved in growing the produce, they're more likely to taste it, and if it's cooked properly, they will more likely enjoy it and have a more balanced diet. So if you want your children to be healthy, get them involved in gardening. Another thing, you can decide what kind of transplant you're going to grow. For instance, when you go down to local garden centers, you can't always find organic transplants. And a number of people are organic growers, and you can buy, for instance, this soil here is an organic growing media. You can buy organic seeds, which are produced organically, and you can buy organic fertilizers, and you can decide how your transplants are grown. And if you want to be an organic grower, you want to start out with transplants that are organically grown also. Do you really save money in this project? You can, but the more plants that you grow, the more likely you are to save money, especially when you're buying your potting media in larger quantities and you're buying bulk quantities of containers, or you're saving containers to grow things, which we will talk about in a later video. But another thing that you can do, if you grow too many transplants, you can sell them to neighbors, or you can go to local garden centers and sell them, especially if you have unusual varieties that people can't get anywhere else. There are a number of factors that will determine whether or not you can successfully produce quality plants, and the number one factor is light. Of course, if we had a greenhouse and we had full sunlight, we could produce really good plants, because on a summer day, you get about 10,000 foot candles on your plants. Now, a foot candle is basically a measurement of brightness when you take a standard candle and you place it next to a white wall about 1 foot away. And the amount of light that produced is called a foot candle. It's just one of the number of ways that light is measured. And so, as I mentioned, during the summer months, the brightness is about 10,000 foot candles, and we have less than half of that during the winter months, depending on where you are in the world. So an overcast day can be quite low. Now, most people, if they're going to grow plants, they wonder, where should I place them? A south exposure is the best. Now, during the winter months, the sun is lower on the horizon, so it's not going to be as bright as it would be later on in the season. But the south exposure is the best. The next best would be west and east. And I have a deck off of my dining room, and it has deck doors, which gives me quite a bit of light. In the living room, I can put plants in my bow casement window, which also gives me quite a bit of light compared to a standard window. But a north exposure, the light is just too low, so I wouldn't even bother. Now, a lot of people like to use artificial light, and the standard light that a lot of people use is the fluorescent fixtures, like the shop lights. And the standard one is about 48-inch bulbs, 2 bulbs in the container, and they will produce around 600 foot candles at about 6 inches from the bulb, because as you get closer to the bulb, the light intensity goes up, and as you get farther away, the light intensity goes down. Now, another thing you have to consider is that as these bulbs get older, they start to lose their ability to produce light, and the brightest light will be toward the middle of the tube, and further out you'll start to see a darkening of the tube, and the light levels will tend to drop. Now, another type of fluorescent light are called the T5s. These are compact fluorescents, and for the size they put out a lot more light than the other fluorescents like the T12. And I have some in my basement, and they really grow transplants very well, so I'm very happy about that. The T5s are superior to the T12s or your regular shop light because the bulbs have a much longer life, between 30 and 42,000 hours compared to about 18,000 hours for your standard fluorescent tubes. Plus the fact the amount of decrease in light produced is much more slowly in the T5. So those are superior, and I have grown plants under those, and they produce excellent quality transplants. Now, another light source are what we call the LEDs, and those are quite expensive, and I don't have any of those, but they're supposedly pretty decent in terms of growing plants. But again, I don't have first-hand experience with those. They're fairly new, and they're quite expensive compared to all the other sources of light. Another light source is the metal halide or high-pressure sodium lights, and these are like putting the sun in your basement. Although you will probably see an increase of about $15 or more depending on how much you pay for electricity, because they really suck up the electricity. Also, they fall off nearly 70% in terms of their light intensity in the first 3 years. So, but they're still quite bright. So I have one given to me, and I've used it to keep young citrus trees alive in my basement. I need to replace the bulb right now, but it's nice having that down there if you have a lot of bigger plants that are in pots on the floor. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the quality of light. Now, you can see I have a prism in my hand here, and if I were outside and I had some direct sunlight, the direct sunlight would come in here, and the light would be bent, and it would come out divided into its various wavelengths. And we have certain wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum that we can actually see, and that would be visible light, and those colors are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And they measure light in what's called nanometers, and what we can see is between about 380 and 750 nanometers on this electromagnetic spectrum. This spectrum also has things like X-rays, gamma rays, radio waves, TV waves, a whole host of things, but we're only interested in the visible light as it relates to plants. Now, the wavelength that plants really like is between 400 and 700 nanometers. This is called the photosynthetic active radiation, or PAR for short. And when you buy a plant light, many of them emit a greater amount of the red and blue range for the plants, because that's what they really like. Now, you'll notice that most plants are kind of green. That's because the majority of green light is reflected from the plants, but they use other portions of the spectrum like yellow. They use some green also. But they really like far red, blue, and regular red. Now, an incandescent bulb is something else that people use. Now, this is an example of an incandescent light. These bulbs aren't even being made anymore. And if I put my hand here, I can really feel heat coming off of this lamp right away. And as I mentioned before, the closer you put the light, the higher the light intensity you're going to have. But as I get closer, this puts out so much heat that it actually can burn the plants and dry them out very quickly. So a fluorescent light is superior to this light, plus the fact the portion of light spectrum that this produces isn't best for plant growth. So we don't use this for that now. I use it for getting my worms out of my worm compost, but that's a whole different story. Now, if you don't have enough light, you may notice as you look at this plant that it's a little fuller on this side than on this side. And what I do is I turn this plant, it's a Frutoni if you're wondering, I turn this plant so that the side that's not getting as much light gets more light, because otherwise you tend to get a plant that grows a lot on one side where the light is and not so much on the other one. So also, if the light levels are low, what happens is the plant stems start to stretch. The distance between where the leaves are attached, which is called the internode, stretches trying to get to the light, and that makes for a weaker plant, and it's more likely to get broken when you're handling it, or if it has really rough weather when you set it outside, like a hard rain or very strong winds or something like that. Okay, the last aspect of light I want to discuss is duration. In other words, how long do we need to have the lights on in order to produce quality plants? And I already mentioned that you want the light as close to the plant surface as possible. So with fluorescents, you could have it maybe a centimeter below the lights, and it's not going to cause any problem because they don't give off much heat. But the closer, the greater light intensity you have. Now, in terms of duration, we need about 14 to 16 hours of light in order to produce good quality transplants. And I strongly recommend that you use a timer, because I have my plants in the basement and I don't always remember to run up and down the stairs to turn on the plant light, and I usually don't get up really early in the morning anyway, so if I want to get 16 hours on, I really should have it on a timer. You can get them at a hardware store for less than $15 and they'll do a pretty good job for you. So in the next video we're going to talk a little bit about containers, and I hope you can join me. See you later.